Hello, everyone. I am Rodrigo Velázquez. I am professor, researcher here in CIDE in the administration department. I want to thank everyone for being here. And I would like to say that if you have any question or any doubt, you can just ask them. And in this way, we're going to have a better understanding in this session. So in this session, we are going to talk about three main topics. And first, we're going to talk about data collection, data analysis, and communication of results. So these are the three main topics that we are going to talk about today. We are going to have some conceptual definitions that are going to help us to understand this session. And I really hope that this is a very useful session for you. And as I told you, if you have any questions, just let me know. And I am going to be very happy to answer your questions. So we are going to review the objectives concerning this session. And the first one, we are going to understand the importance of evidence in the public policy process. When we talk about data, in order to understand data collection and data analysis, we need to talk about evidence and why is it so important concerning any public policy process or implementation. So this is the first thing that we're going to talk about. Then we are going to see this in more detail, but we're going to see that evidence is a set of elements that have to be organized, systematized, in order to understand the argument or ratio that we want to analyze. So there are some requirements that we're going to analyze in more detail, but this is the first point concerning this session, understanding evidence and why is it important in the public policy process. The second objective of this session is to understand and identify the two main types of data that provide evidence, and evidence is comprises data or information. However, there are many kinds of information, and one of the ways to classify data or information is either quantitative, in a quantitative or qualitative way, and we're going to see the differences and why it's important to understand the different types of information that we have, and this is also going to help us to collect data. So we have to review some data analysis and some techniques. However, this session we are not going to have enough time. So if you are interested in this, then we're going to see this in more detail concerning the different techniques. There are many documents concerning each one of the techniques that we are going to analyze. And also we are going to see how to analyze data. So the first step has to do with understanding the main types of data that we can use in order to strengthen or to provide a basis for our evidence and for the public policy process. A fourth point in this session, and also in the next one, has to do with the effective forms of communication of results. So let's say that with this, we are going to have a better understanding, or this is another step for this session. First, we're going to understand what evidence is. Then we're going to analyze the different types of information or data, their differences, and also some techniques that we're going to analyze. And of course, something that needs to be taken into account if this process to understand, to classify, and systematize is not conveyed in a clear way. And we're not only talking about including the ones the decision makers, but also the public in general. So let's remember that every single public policy is going to be more effective if we include more people, if more people understand this, and if more people are involved in this process. And therefore, it is very important to that everything that we communicate, and especially evidence must be submitted in a systematic way and in an easy way. This has to be understand. So we're going to analyze the different types, but this is very important. And the fifth point concerning the objectives of this session, this is we're going to analyze examples of evidence use and data. And for this, one of the tools that we're going to use is Mentimeter. I think that you have previously used this. So we are going to analyze the different examples that I am going to provide so that this can be clearly understood. So this are the objectives of this session. So let's talk about the first one. And this has to do with the importance of evidence and understanding what evidence is. So for this, a previous step, I would like to, in Mentimeter, I would like you to describe evidence in just one word. You can use the link that you have here in the chat. Just click that link and you can access this. So just describe how you would define this from your experience, from your previous knowledge, what you have learned so far in this session and in the previous session. So please click that link and you can define what evidence means in just one word. So I'm going to give you some time so you can access the link and then you can write your answer. You can already see the link in the chat. So you are going to receive the link so that you can access the website. So that you can access Mentimeter and you can answer this question. So you have to define what evidence means in just one word. I think that this is working well so far. I am receiving your answers. So I'm going to give you some more minutes so you can answer the question. If you cannot access this website, you can let me know so we can help you. So far, we have four answers. We're going to wait a bit more so that you can describe what evidence means in just one word. We have another answer. So we are just receiving another answer. Thank you so much. I'm going to give you 1 more minute so you can write your answers. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. So just remember that this is a very brief exercise, you have to define what evidence means in just one word. Okay, perfect. So we are going to read the answers that we have received so far. And the participants in this session said that this has to do with information. So this is a way of the evidence is information. And of course, you were right, because we are going to see a another definition that has to do with information. This is a test. Evidence proves an argument. This also has to do with what we're going to see. This is also a backup or support. This has to do with knowledge and a means of verification. So we can say that these words are related to what we're going to see. And you are also saying that this can be proved. Evidence is something that can be proved. So this is a means of verification that can be proved, and that proves something that is understood as truth. So we have another question. This has to do with facts. Evidence also has facts. Yes, you're right. And knowledge. So evidence also helps us to acquire more knowledge regarding some theory, hypothesis, or statement. Okay, so perfect. Yes. Everything that you have said so far, I think that the most frequent answer was information. And we can say that the answers that we have received so far are directly or indirectly related to the word evidence. So we can say that evidence is information, it is knowledge, its objective is to verify, or a fact, this is a means of verification. We can use this to prove, and it also contains information. So I think that we have a very clear idea of what this word includes or means. Okay, so now we're going to see a definition. What literature says concerning this, and we have this here. So this definition says that it is a set of facts, data, records, testimonies, analysis, documents, and other types of information that support an argument. So as you can see, everything that you answered in the previous exercise, it is very related to this. So we can say that evidence is a set of information that supports an argument. And this type of evidence can be diverse. For instance, this can be data, facts, records, testimonies, analysis. We also include analysis as evidence because this doesn't only include isolated records, but it also includes analysis, and we can consider this as evidence. And something that is very important is that this set of information, they have to support an argument, and we are going to see how this is achieved. And well, one of the main characteristics of evidence is that it increases the soundness of an argument. In public policy, as well as in other disciplines or sciences that are not exact, the researchers provide evidence in order to support an argument, and in this way they provide information, different types of information to support an argument. However, I think that it is very relevant to remember that, of course, there are no absolute truths. We try to provide evidence. We try to collect data to support an argument. However, we cannot say that this is 100% truth. We cannot say that this evidence cannot be refuted, because of course we are going to have different types of evidence and we're going to see the characteristics that it has to have. However, in social sciences, an argument cannot be refuted because we are always trying to prove hypotheses, theories, arguments, and of course they are modified. We have different types of modifications, and new evidence is either supporting, ratifying an argument, or also changing or modifying these arguments. However, the essence of evidence is to provide, increase the soundness of an argument, and this is what we want to achieve when we are designing a public policy. We want to provide evidence concerning our theory of change or hypothesis. So now we are going to analyze the different requirements of solid evidence according to these to Booth and his colleagues, Columb and Williams, in 2018, and they say that evidence has some specific requirements in order to be considered as solid evidence. So the first characteristic has to do with sufficiency. And what do I mean by sufficiency? Well, it has to be enough. For instance, if we do not have enough information concerning or evidence concerning this theory of change or hypothesis, is not going to be proved. So evidence has to be sufficient or enough. But what happens when it is not enough or sufficient? Well, when that is the case, we are going to have a lot of questions or a lot of doubts, and maybe the decision maker or the public who is analyzing this public policy is going to start doubting, and then they are going to have a lot of questions and they are not going to be that involved in the public policy. However, if this is not the case, if we were able to collect enough information and data, and if it supports an argument, then of course it has to do with soundness, something that is true. So if we collect enough information during a lot of years or during many months, we are going to be sure that we have solid evidence. So this is a very important characteristic that we need to take into account, and we need to try to have sufficient evidence. But what happens, for instance, if this is evidence that has to do with anecdotes? And this is what the researchers in social sciences try to avoid. Evidence that has to do with anecdotes is the one that, for instance, when someone said something just to prove something, or maybe because I listened to him or her in the news, and maybe he said that he had some effect, but maybe he is my neighbor or he is part of my family. So this has to do with a story or an anecdote. And in many journals or they provide information that is not solid, that is not enough or sufficient. Therefore, this cannot be considered as something important for public policies. Of course, we can have some testimonies concerning pilot tests. We can have elements concerning focus groups or individuals. But this is just a part of evidence. in order for it to be sufficient, we have to provide more in a systematized way. And this has to have to do with the characteristics that we are going to mention. So remember that if you have a lot of evidence, it is going to be better for you. So let's say that this is a first requirement that we need to take into account. And the second requirement has to do with the fact that evidence has to be of public access. And this means that the decision makers have to be able to access this evidence. For instance, if we are saying that a specific medication helps to decrease the prevalence of a specific disease, then the evidence of the study has to be public. We cannot provide evidence that is not able to be accessed, because people are not going to believe what we are saying. For instance, if our intention to eradicate or improve a problem is not going to be successful if the evidence cannot be accessed. So when we provide evidence, we have to include the information sources and these studies or diagnoses, and we need to include the information concerning these studies and diagnoses, and they have to be available for everyone. So it is very important that the information that we have as evidence, it should be of public access. So this is a way in which the public in general and the decision makers can analyze and review this information, and they can access this information. And in this way, they can review if this information is sufficient. The third requirement has to do with the fact that it is representative. This means that evidence must show that it is not selected. For instance, if we are talking about a group of individuals suffering from a public problem, and if we only select some cases or some individuals in our study, then of course this is not going to be representative. So we have to include a sufficient sample so that the evidence that comes from this study is representative of the group or community that we are trying to help, or the one who is going to be included in the program. So this study or diagnosis, if it cannot include all the information, then evidence must provide elements from that group in a representative way. And for instance, if we only select some cases, then of course it is not going to be representative, and our evidence is going to be less solid and robust. So this is another element that is very important to take into account. So maybe you have already seen some studies where evidence can be sufficient concerning an argument or a hypothesis. This can be of public access because we have the links or the information. This can be representative, but maybe it is not accurate. And evidence must be accurate because it has to be related to the problem that we are trying to solve in terms of public policy. For instance, if we want to decrease mortality rate, the action that has to be implemented has to be related and evidence has to be also related to information that tries to solve the problem concerning the mortality ratio. So, of course, it is not important if we show evidence that is not related to our objective. So, when we talk about accuracy and when we show evidence that supports our argument, it is also very important to avoid terms such as some, many, frequently, generally. If we say that maybe some medication generally decreases a specific prevalence, then of course it is very ambiguous to say that this is done generally. Or for instance, also if we say many times, this term is not going to help us. However, if we say that this medication is 60% effective, we're being accurate and precise. So when we show evidence concerning the preparation or design of public policy, we have to be accurate. So we have to avoid these terms that otherwise are ambiguous. We have to provide precise and accurate data and information that are related to the objective that wants to be achieved. So this is another point that has to be taken into account. The next requirement has to do with reliability. Evidence that is reliable is the one that was understood how it was collected or carried out. This has to do with a methodology that is well described, and the organizations that systematized or analyzed such evidence are organizations that work. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example. If when we prepare a public policy, if we include organizations such as economists or the World Bank, we know that they are institutions, well-established institutions that provide reliable information. So for instance, if this has to do with the fact that the evidence is able to be accessed, so we know that we can check this information in various websites concerning these institutions. And of course, these institutions are world organizations. Of course, we also have some other information, national information, for instance, census and information that is collected in a national way. For instance, in Mexico, it would be INEGI. And in other countries, I guess you also have this kind of institutions. So let's say that reliability has to do with public access and also with the institutions that collect information. So of course, not every single evidence is going to come from the World Bank or other organizations. Sometimes the one who are in charge of this, they are the ones who collect information, evidence, and concerning reliability, what they do is they are transparent. They are transparent concerning the methodology, and we have to be descriptive and concerning how the information was collected and reviewed. If we describe this in detail and if we are transparent, of course, this is going to be reliable, even if the information doesn't come from well-established institutions. So we're going to talk about this later on, but right now I think that it is very important to highlight the fact that reliability has to do with transparency concerning data collection and analysis, and also it has to do with the source. So this is something that we have to take into account. And lastly, this has to do with relevance. So evidence has to be relevant concerning what we want to achieve. For instance, this can be sufficient, this can be of public access, representative, accurate, but if this is not relevant or if it is not directly related to what we want to solve or achieve, then we are not going to achieve our objectives. Maybe because we were not able to convince the decision makers, or maybe because the public or the citizens were aware of the fact that this program doesn't have relevant. And for instance, concerning the example that I gave you before, if we see that the evidence doesn't provide relevant information in that sense, if this medication is not treating the disease or problem, or maybe if it is helpful for other things but not for the specific disease, then this can be sufficient, but maybe this is not accurate and reliable. And if it is not relevant for the problem that we want to treat, then we're going to have some problems. So in a general way, we have to take into account and we have to analyze these requirements, because the evidence that we process and we analyze has to include these requirements. If we do this in this way, then of course we're going to have it is going to be more likely that we achieve our objectives. Of course, this is not the only thing. Of course, it doesn't only depend on the requirements, but this is going to help us. And now I am going to give you an example from Booth, Campbell's and Williams, and in a very easy way, they teach us how to apply these requirements. So this is a conversation between a kid and his mother. And before we delve into this conversation, in this conversation, the kid is saying that he needs and requires new shoes. And then he provides information and elements to be able to support his argument. And then the mother is not 100% convinced. Let's say that she doesn't believe in what the kid is saying, and she's also providing elements of why the evidence doesn't comply with the requirements that we have previously seen. So let's analyze this step by step concerning the conversation that they are having. Just give me 1 second so I just want to know that if you have any question or comment or something that you want to add so far. Just give me 1 second, please. Okay, you don't have any questions, right? So let's analyze this exercise. So they have this conversation, and in this case, the kid has an objective. He wants to have new shoes. So for this, he has to convince his mother, of course. I can see here that Jimena says arguments are sufficient as evidence. Yes, I think that this is something very important to talk about. Thank you so much for your question. Well, arguments have to be supported by evidence in order to be valid. So that this has to do with the soundness of the arguments, and they have to be supported by evidence. And I think that with this example, we're going to understand this in a better way. So thank you so much, Jimena, for your question. And if after the example you still have questions, then I'm going to be very happy to answer this question. So in this first conversation that we have here, the kid says, okay, I need some new shoes. So that is the objective that he wants to achieve, and that is his argument. And the evidence, he says, the ones that I have are very small. So based on the previous slide concerning the requirements of sufficiency, public access, representative, accurate, reliable, and relevant, if we analyze this first evidence, it is very simple. It is a very simple evidence. And he says the actual shoes that I have are very small. So what can we say? Please, if you can write your answer, what kind of evidence is this? What requirement do we have here? And which one complies with this? It has to do with the fact that the shoes are very small. And this is sufficient evidence to support his argument concerning the need of getting new shoes. Or maybe it is not sufficient. What do you think? Here we have an answer. No, it is not enough. Okay, yes. Yes, you're right. No, it is not sufficient because actually the mother in this example says, she provides a counter argument. She says, your feet have not grown so much in a month and they do not hurt you. So it might be possible that maybe he has bigger feet. However, it is not enough to be able to achieve what he wants or to get new shoes, right? Because he is not being accurate. For instance, if he says, okay, no, my feet are bigger and my current shoes are not adequate, they hurt me, then this would be more accurate information or evidence. Even if the evidence is true, even if his feet are bigger, it is not enough to achieve his objective. So thank you so much for your answer. And then he says, okay, but they are dirty for school. They do not look clean. So again, in this case, he's providing evidence because he wants to achieve an objective. So he's providing evidence to achieve his objective. So he says, okay, they are dirty. They do not look clean. And in this case, the mother says, okay, we can clean them if we wash them. We do not have to buy new ones. So again, in this case, the mother is saying that this is not sufficient evidence to achieve his objective in order to get new ones because there is something to clean them. She can clean his shoes with some water and soap. So of course, this is not enough or sufficient evidence. And in this case, the evidence is not sufficient again. However, this can be accurate because yes, maybe it is true that they are dirty. And in this case, this is of public access because you can see that they are dirty, and they are accurate because they are dirty. But of course, this is not sufficient evidence to be able to achieve his objective. So again, in this case, the mother says, no, this is not sufficient evidence. I am not convinced. And the third argument says, okay, but these shoes hurt me. See how I limp. So he cannot walk. He's saying that he cannot walk because they hurt. So in this case, the mother says, okay, but you were perfectly walking a minute ago. Of course, he can walk. So what the kid is saying in this case is evidence that is not representative, because in this very simple example that I am giving you, the mother says that the kid is walking and she never noticed that he was limping, but however right now he's limping, and she says, okay, but you were perfectly walking a minute ago. This means that this evidence is not representative. of course, he is pretending to get new shoes, and when he starts limping, this is not sufficient nor representative evidence concerning the problem that he's saying. And finally, in this example, the kid includes his friends. He says, my friends think I should have new shoes. And then the mother says, okay, your friends do not make decisions in this house. So in this case, we're saying that the kid is trying to include his friends, these testimonies that are going to help him to achieve his objective. But of course, they are not the ones who are going to make decisions, or they do not have the authority to decide if he needs new shoes or not. So this kid in this case is including his friends' testimonies, but they are not reliable because this is not reliable evidence concerning what wants to be achieved. So in this very simple example that I wanted to give you, we can have evidence that is accurate but not sufficient. We can have evidence that is true, however, it is not representative, and we can have evidence that may be sufficient because maybe in this case the kid included 50 of his friends, but it is not reliable because their testimonies are not reliable. So in this very simple example, we can analyze the complexity that evidence requires, the requirements that we were previously talking about. So we have to take into account every single one of these requirements so that our evidence strongly supports an argument. So now that we have understood this, of course, you can make questions if you have some. So the importance of the evidence and the requirements in this case, how does the public policy is related to the evidence? So of course there is a term that has been used in the analysis of public policy, and this term is based on evidence. So several authors and several definitions say that this is the definition that I am going to include in this slide. This is by Stocker and Evans, and he says that this is based on research, and this means that the research results provide evidence, different types of evidence that supports these actions or interventions. So this justifies the usage of this. So this is evidence-based public policy must help decision makers to have a better understanding of the conditions. So this contains testimonies, data, and this has different types of information that supports or justifies the actions that are going to be designed in the programs that are going to be implemented by several organizations or just one organization. So evidence-based public policy and its objective is to contribute and help decision makers to have a better understanding of the conditions under which public policy is developed. So it is very helpful to understand in a more comprehensive way evidence, and it is the objective. It is not only used to achieve an objective that can be achieved without evidence, but its objective is to have a better understanding of the problem. And if we do this, we can achieve our objective in a better way. So we already analyzed the evidence of a solid evidence. We have already seen the problems concerning the previous example that I gave you. So now we are going to talk about usefulness. So why do we want evidence? Why is it useful? Because as you already know, And as many decision makers know, we do not need to have evidence to implement a public policy and to have this. If maybe until the evaluation stage, we're going to collect evidence concerning this governmental action, but not necessarily from the beginning. So why is it useful? How do we use evidence? So a first point is that it provides information, as I was previously saying. It provides information for the understanding of public problems. When we have evidence, different types of evidence that is representative of public access, reliable and relevant, of course, we're going to be able to understand the public problem that we want to solve. And there are many complex problems, such as poverty, for instance, and it has to be studied, and we need to have information, different types of information, to have a better understanding. And in this way, we're going to be able to implement government actions to be able to understand this in a better way. If we provide evidence, and if this evidence is not analyzed in a systematic way, and if it lacks some requirements, then of course it is going to be very difficult to understand the problems. And as you already know, of course this happens a lot, because sometimes there is not enough information, or maybe there's not enough evidence to be able to have a government program. However, maybe this is done because other types of things, maybe because they're and not because we have the necessary evidence, and this leads to not understanding the problem. So of course we have to provide evidence for public problems. And when evidence is provided, of course, we also identify the different causes of a problem. When we analyze a problem, when we analyze the information related to this problem, then we are going to understand the public program and also what is causing it. So for this, we have to collect data. And for instance, school of course we are going to need many types of information to identify why children are not going to school, why they are not finishing school. So of course we have to collect information and data, and in this way we're going to be able to have theories of change. And in this case, we're going to identify the variables that are related. So that's why it is very important to include evidence. The third point has to do with the fact that that evidence contributes to the formulation of different solutions and creation of actions. So of course, this is related to the previous ones. Through evidence, we understand public problems and we identify the causes, but also we can offer and design solutions, and we can also implement actions to solve the problem. So of course this is another very important element to take into account. And then evidence provides elements for the paradigm shift. So through data collection and through data usage and information with these requirements that we have mentioned, through this we can change a paradigm. For instance, I'm going to give you an example that happens in many countries with insecurity. So from some years ago, we were only talking about public safety, that had to do with some actions implemented by the police, and through many and diverse studies and thanks to different authors, they have noticed that this term or that this paradigm is not necessarily in a systematic way. It is not helping to solve these problems. So, of course, we have had many elements and evidence And if we only rely on the police, of course, in this is not going to help us to achieve the objectives. And that's why this paradigm has been changed in many cities, and this has been changed to citizens security. And of course, it has to do with, it is different from the other one, because this new one has to do with the communication and direct collaboration. It has to do with a constant collaboration between the authorities and the citizens. So this is not only related to the police. The police is not the only one in charge, but we as citizens, we also have something to do regarding the design and implementation and also evaluation. So this concept concerning the citizen security was changed because the other paradigm was not solving the problem. So of course it was necessary to include the citizens to be able to have better results. So let's say that through evidence, we also had this paradigm shift. The other point has to do with the fact that evidence establishes criteria or standards for evaluation. So as you have seen in these sessions, evaluation without evidence cannot exist. And it is not only important for evaluation, but because it also establishes criteria or standards for evaluation. When we are evaluating a program or public action, data collection and systematization is going to help us to establish criteria to evaluate the program or public policy. And finally, we can say that, well, we can talk about many more reasons, but finally, providing evidence reduces importance of interests and ideologies. So in many cases, decision makers design or implement public policies following some ideologies, but of course they lack evidence. And when we provide evidence and when we collect information, this is going to reduce the importance. Of course, this cannot be eliminated but providing evidence can help us to reduce this importance. And in this way, we can also modify government actions. And we can see this very often concerning social welfare programs, because there exists evidence that says that some programs are not very effective. And when we show this evidence to the decision makers, then they can modify or change some public programs. And on the contrary, there are others that support what some interest or ideologies say, but at least in this case, we have some evidence that what they are saying is not related to an ideology or interest. So of course there is evidence that can help us to solve this problem. And of course that this is also a very important thing to take into account. And now, very quickly, we can see in this case that in many countries, evidence, although an agency or a group of people exists in each institution, it is not used always. And the question is why? Well, because literature has included many factors or obstacles of why the evidence is not used as we would like to. And here in this slide, it has to do with the requirements that we have previously talked about, and this has to do with solid evidence. So in many cases, there is a mistrust concerning the source. So if we are not clear of how we collected data and we are not transparent, of course, we're not going to be trusted. So of course, there is going to be a serious mistrust concerning the citizens and the decision makers. And in many times, evidence is not used because it doesn't respond to the needs of the decision makers. And it has to do with the interests and the ideology that we're including. Because in many cases, the evidence that exists is not related to what the decision makers want. So public actions that are going to be implemented are not going to be supported by evidence because of course it doesn't respond to the needs. And of course another thing has to do with contradictory evidence because unfortunately the evidence that someone can recollect is not going to be related all the time. So to solve this, we're going to talk about this later on, but to be able to solve this we have to analyze the context. If there are two types of information or of evidence or of contradictory evidence, we have to analyze where it was applied and where it worked. So this can be achieved through a more detailed analysis. The other thing has to do with fragmentation of data and information. So many times we have information, but maybe this is fragmented. So decision makers cannot see this in a concrete or in a concrete way. So of course they are not going to include this. And another thing has to do with contingency evidence, and this has to do with the fact that this is not representative, because maybe we can show evidence of, for instance, a government program, but maybe this was related to a very specific period of time. So of course this is not representative. The solution or action that is being taken into account maybe happens in a very particular context that of course is not going to happen again. So this leads to the fact that this is not representative. Another thing has to do with political motives, because I am not going to spend a lot of time explaining this. Something else has to do with partiality, evidence partiality, because maybe decision makers are not going to trust in this because they say, okay, maybe evidence is not solid, this is not working. And we are going to talk about this in another example, and this has to do with the lack of context concerning evidence. If we do not provide details of how the government action or program is implemented under what circumstances, then it is going to be an obstacle because it lacks soundness. And this has to do with the next step that has to do with lack of details. If we do not have enough details concerning the evidence or how the evidence supports our theory of change, and if we do not have a context that is explained, then we are not going to use evidence. And the last point that we have talked about, and I think that it was clearly explained with the example that I gave you before. So this has to do with the fact that evidence is not directly related to a problem. And in many cases, sometimes we have evidence that is not related to the problem that we want to solve. So of course, this evidence lacks soundness. And now we are going to talk about when we have to provide evidence. And for this, I am going to make another question. So I am going to ask you to access the link. Here I have another question that I would like you to answer. And the question is, in what stages of the public process do we have to provide evidence? And then we have some options. The first one has to do with, it says previous to the formulation, during the design of the public policy, and the third option has to do with the implementation. The fourth option has to do with the evaluation of the public policy, and there is a fifth answer that includes all. So we are getting some answers. I want to thank you so much. So please access the link and answer the question. We are going to analyze this in a pie graph. We're going to see your answers. I'm going to give you some minutes. So far, you are saying that evidence has to be provided in evaluation, in implementation. 25% says that this has to be provided in the evaluation, and the other 25% said that this has to be provided previous to the formulation. So I am going to give you some more minutes so that you can submit your answers. The percentage increased because you are saying that this has to be provided previous to the formulation. So I really want to thank every one of you. Please answer the question. You can answer this question by accessing the link that you have in the chat. Do we have any other answer? The question is, in what stages of the public process do we have to provide evidence? Okay, thank you so much. We are receiving more answers. I am going to give you a few more minutes so that we can keep moving forward with this presentation. Okay, so far we have here in the answers that we have received so far, you think that 29%. Okay, we have another answer. So 25% says that during evaluation, 33% says that previous to the formulation of the public policy, 22% says during implementation, and 11% says during the design of the public policy. So in this case, it is very important to pinpoint that we have a new answer. The percentage is changing, but the one you are saying that it has to be provided during the evaluation. And I think that in this stage we can see evidence. However, I want to say all of you that you are right. All of you are right. Because in every single stage of the public policy, it is very important to include evidence, and we're going to delve into it. We're going to talk about the stages and why is it important. But concerning the exercise, although most of you say that during the evaluation, the other options are also right. So of course, all of you also said that during the other stages. And the answer is related to this because we can use evidence in every single stage. So previous to the formulation of the public policy, which most of you said, and during this stage, it has to be showed that the proposed policy worked elsewhere. So the majority of the government actions that are implemented in the different sectors of the government were already implemented, or maybe just a version was implemented somewhere else. So Cartwright and Hardy said that if we have this evidence, then we have to provide this evidence previous to the formulation, because we can say that we have evidence that supports the fact that some actions or that a set of government actions are related to solve the problem that we identified. And in addition, when we are talking about the fact that they worked somewhere else, this means that in a particular context, for a specific population, or on a specific moment, this public policy or public program worked. So previous to the formulation or prior to the formulation, if we have this evidence, and that's why it is important to have this, because in this way we are supporting or justifying the way in which we act. So if we have this evidence, it is important to collect the evidence, and in this way we can show the decision makers that we have evidence that says that this can be successful. During the design, during the public policy design, some of you said that it is important to provide evidence during this stage. And here what we are saying is that evidence has to be provided concerning the fact that this public policy that worked somewhere else can be implemented wherever the decision maker wants to implement this. And in this case, we have to include more details. And this means that we're going to have evidence of the conditions related to the context, population, and moment to implement this action or government program. So it is not only important to identify that in other parts of the country or world this policy worked, but that context in which it worked is similar to our context. So of course it is going to be more likely to be successful. And this is done during the public policy design. So in this case, we can provide evidence concerning the context. And even if it is not the same context, evidence can provide information concerning the fact that it is more likely to work, and maybe there are some changes or modifications that we have to make. So once that this public policy has been designed, then we're going to implement this public policy. And prior to implementation, we can also collect information and data. For instance, we can conduct pilot tests concerning many programs, and many governments actually conduct them. And prior to a public action, we conduct pilot tests to analyze how it is working. So in this case, we are implementing and also collecting information, and this information is going to provide evidence. For instance, if we have to make some changes or if we have to adjust the government action. So in this stage, it is also very important to provide evidence. And of course, in the implementation, it is also important. So of course, it is not necessary to wait until all the actions are implemented to then go to the evaluation stage and then provide evidence. So we can have some exercises, some evaluation exercises during the implementation process. So we do not necessarily have to meet an implementation cycle to be able to evaluate. We can have some stages in, and then we analyze how this is working. So we have to collect data, information, and systematize them. And we have to analyze how this government action is being implemented. And finally, and I think that in this stage, this is more clear, because of course, there is no evaluation without evidence. We have to provide evidence. Evidence is fundamental in evaluation. So of course, we have techniques, methodologies for the evaluation, but it has to include evidence so that we can have a better understanding of the public action and how it is working, if it is improving or not the problem that it wants to solve. So in a general way, we can say that generally evidence can be provided in every single stage of the public policy, and these stages have their own objectives concerning the adjustment, and it also has to do with the fact of analyzing how this is working or if we have to change something. And in this slide, or in this example that Cartwright and Hardy provide, we can see here that it is important to provide evidence in the public policy. So the objective says that the objective of the governmental program is to increase reading test scores concerning a specific school. So the action to implement has to do with homeworks for students, with exercises related to improving reading or to improve reading. And evidence, in this case, the evidence that led to this implementation was that this type of homework increased grades in another school district. So we're talking about school districts in the States. School districts comprises several schools, so it was identified that this type of homework increased grades. However, it was also identified that this action was implemented under certain conditions. So in this example, by Cartwright and Hardy, they are saying that yes, homeworks can increase grades in reading tests. However, homework and the implementation of this action is not done just because. It was implemented under specific conditions. And in this case, we also have to collect data and analyze if we want to establish, if where we want to establish this action has to do with the conditions and the evidence that we have. So I am going to show this graphic. And here we have the different factors or conditions related to the action. And particularly in this example, in this previous example that I gave you, and as you can notice in this graph, in this pie graph, the homework is the action implemented in this set of schools. Homework is the action that wants to increase grades in reading tests in schools. However, a research and the evidence that was found in the other school districts where this worked is that homework was not applied in isolation but under specific conditions, and the conditions are shown in this slide and in this graph. And okay, they are saying that homework worked in places where they had some motivation to increase their grades. So of course students had previous skills for learning. They were able to learn some things, and evidence in this case showed that some other tests had these skills. And also there was family support. Their parents were worried because they wanted their kids to increase their grades. So of course they had a family support so that kids were able to increase their grades. Another very important conditions related to this action was the fact that the kids were able to study. They had time to study, or they had a space or an area to study, because maybe we can have relevant actions, but if we do not have the areas for them to do this, then the action cannot be implemented because physically there is no space to do this or area. Another thing has to do with school assistance and feedback. So of course it is very important that the parents and the teachers review the homeworks. Of course they have to have feedback, because if we only consider homework, this is not going to be to help. But if we analyze this with all these specific conditions in this graph, then this can be successful. And of course this also had to do with school assistants. Maybe they were doing their homework, but maybe they did not have this feedback, and feedback is very important to achieve the objective. So in this example, the homework, which is the government action, and of course we have evidence, has to include other factors and conditions, and we also have evidence for them. So we as decision makers, or we have to analyze if these conditions exist and if we have evidence that they exist. And if they exist, of course, we have to collect data and we have to present or submit this evidence. And with this type of studies or data collection or data systematization, we can be sure, and of course, it is going to be more likely that the public action or or program is going to be successful. So in this case, we do not need to only search for evidence concerning the effectiveness of a program, but also we have to take into account the conditions related to this action. And in most cases, we can have some sort of evidence, because it is very common that, and maybe you might have some examples. It is very common to see how governments implement public actions that have worked somewhere else, but that doesn't work in our context. And why? Well, because these conditions are not included in this context. So, of course, if we do not have these conditions, then this program is not going to work, or maybe it is not going to be successful. So every single government action has to be supported by evidence concerning the action that was to be implemented, but also the conditions that we want to achieve. So it is very important to take into account this. And in order to summarize or to recap, in this slide, it says that the usage of evidence provides more information for decision makers. And in this case, we can have a better formulation of the public policy in its different stages, as we have seen. And this also helps us to reach the set objectives, the objective set. So the first point has to do with evidence usage, because this is a process that is going to provide more information. And of course, if we have more information, we're going to have a better formulation of the public policy. And of course, we're going to achieve our objectives, the objectives that were set. So this summarizes what we have been talking about. We have some more minutes because of the problems that we have when we started the session. So we are going to continue analyzing the different types of data that provide evidence. So I am going to talk about what we're going to talk in the next session, and we are going to delve into it in the next session. So in the beginning of this session, I already said that evidence is this set of evidence. We talk about data. So data can be defined as a piece of information for the analysis, and this is used as a basis for inference. So it is a type of information, but it also is organized and it is used to analyze, and particularly for inference. So datum, which is singular, is a piece of information, and generally in studies and diagnosis, it is also understood as observation. So if we talk about data in plural or information, but when we talk about datum in singular, we are talking about an observation. And we are going to see this difference because it is very important in studies. And we also said that data is important for inference. So we're going to briefly see this. So inference is a process of data analysis whereby we can obtain conclusions concerning concepts and hypotheses. So when we collect data and when we analyze data, we are making an inference because this is an analysis process. And the objective of inference is to draw conclusions concerning a concept, a hypothesis, or a specific action that we want to analyze, and the information of a specific action. So when we analyze data in a more precise way, we make inferences, and we have two types of inference: descriptive inference and causal inference. So in order to draw conclusions concerning a result, phenomena, or effect, this is descriptive inference, because in this case we are collecting and analyzing data to be able to answer how this happened. And the other type of inference is causal inference. So the objective is to review data to draw conclusions about why an effect or result took place. So in this case, we have two types of inference that provide information concerning the same phenomenon. One has to do with the fact of how it happened, and the other one says why it happened. So if we talk about the previous example concerning Cartwright and Hardy, concerning homeworks and how they could increase grades or improve grades in reading tests, if we could collect data concerning an important amount of kids that had these homeworks, and if we collected information and data and descriptive information concerning regarding how the kid in his learning through these homeworks, and with the family support, the conditions that we were mentioning, feedback and everything else, then we would be doing a descriptive inference analysis of how the kid, when he had family support, when he received feedback, and due to the fact that he had an area to make his homework, then he improved his grades. And in this case we would have a descriptive analysis. In addition, if we were only reviewing and if we only collected information of how many homeworks were made by this kid, and if we collect information concerning his tests, then we would be reviewing and obtaining information and analyzing this information. And this involves causal inferences of how the usage of homeworks improve grades. And in this case, we would be making a causal inference. For instance, the amount of homeworks and the results obtained. So in this case, we are reviewing data to understand why he passed the test or maybe he flunked the test. So if we only analyze data and tests, then we would be making a causal inference. So each one of these inferences leads to different types of data collection and different types of information to analyze. And we are going to talk about this in the next session. So I just wanted to make a brief introduction concerning these two types of definitions. And analysis data is used to make inferences, and we are going to see how this is related to the theory of change. So generally, the inferences that we make when we establish a theory of change, and the evidence that we collect to support this theory, is causal, because we see that when we increase some variables or indicators concerning some variables, we can obtain a change in the result that we want to achieve, or in maybe the problem that we want to solve. So far, do you have any question or any doubt concerning what we have seen so far in this session, concerning the evidence, the usage of evidence, the requirements, concerning the fact that we have solid information? So I just wanted to finish this session. I want to ask you if you have anything that you want to add, or if you have any questions, please feel free to ask before we finish this session. So everything clear? Do you want to add something? Do you have any question, comment, or anything that you want to say? Okay, so I think that everything was clear. I think that you do not want to add something. And if you do want to say something later, Violeta, thank you so much for your comments. We're going to talk about this in the next session. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the next session. Wendy, thank you so much for your comments. So I just want to thank all of you for your attention and your patience. So if you have any question or any doubt in the next session, please feel free to ask this question. And thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really happy to be here with you, Milton. So thank you so much. And have a great day. And I'll see you on Thursday. So thank you so much.